Welcome to the Media Navigators podcast, brought to you by the World Media Group. My name is Belinda Barker and I'm the Chief Executive. Today's podcast is going to have a slightly different format. I'm going to step back and join the audience, and as we're going to be joined by three amazing editors and journalists, all of them at the pinnacle of their careers, in a conversation talking about how and why they got into journalism, what motivates them, and around the roles and responsibilities of telling truthful, honest, well-researched stories, and the bond of trust that is built up between journalism brands such as the members of the World Media Group. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to Anne McElvoy, who is the executive editor for The Economist and will be leading this conversation. Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Belinda. I'm delighted to be in the chair for this conversation, but I see it as a conversation between myself and my two guests, co-conspirators joining us today. Srivastava, who is with Inside. She is a senior business journalist and editor there. So welcome to you, Spriha.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much.
And next to her on my screen is Yasmeen Serhan from The Atlantic, who is based in London, covering Europe, and in particular emphasis on populism and resurgent nationalism, is what they might mean in the context of today. Hi. And as nobody knows what an executive editor is, I thought I would just briefly explain what I do. I'm on the senior editorial leadership team here at The Economist. So I look after strategy and what we should be doing next in terms of development and help the editor sort of on that. And I also host a show called The Economist Asks with lots of very good guests, we like to think, which is a chat show format. And I do that for Economist podcasts. But I'm going to start by asking, I think I'll give Spriha first. Spriha, tell us a bit about why you're in journalism at all and the route that took you there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And thank you for having me on this podcast. I think journalism happened to me by accident. And I always enjoyed writing. I remember growing up, one of the best things, or one of my favorite things used to be writing a diary or writing, stories and writing like really long scripted plays. But I also was very interested in sort of the foreign policy side of things, so politics and understanding how things happen in the international world order. I was brought up in India. That's where I was raised. And I figured out that very quickly that the media in India was very, very inward looking. It was very domestic news that was focused. And I always wanted to read more about what's happening outside of India. The two things met when there was a job opportunity out there for an internship in a foreign policy magazine. And I realized that I like writing and I like news. Let me just give this a try. I was at uni, still trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Wasn't very clear. So I took this particular opportunity. It was a 6-month internship with a very senior journalist in India. And within the first couple of weeks, I realized that this is my strength. This is what I like doing. I love writing. I love reading about what's going on. And then I love to find sources who I could then pick up the phone and ask what's next. There was something about that entire experience that within the first few weeks, I was like, this is what I want to do. And then the next step from that was applying for a formal, degree in journalism. So I came to London in 2008, September, to do a master's in international journalism at City University. Funnily, I landed in London just 3 days before the financial crisis, before Lehman Brothers collapsed, as you all know. I had no idea what was going on at that time in the world. I was very focused on political journalism, and that's what I wanted to do. But I started understanding that, one, there was a need for more and more financial journalists. Newsrooms were really hungry for people who understood finance, for them to be able to break down these big concepts of quantitative easing. And the second thing was, I felt suddenly the entire focus of political journalism was being viewed through the lens of finance. so countries like the US, who had a lot of money, were able to bail out their banks very quickly. But the European Union, for instance, did not have a single supervisory board. So all of the European banks sort of felt behind. And that's when you realized who has the power. And I got very interested in that. I started doing internships at various places. At CNBC to start with. And a lot of it was also sort of just self-taught. So I did a lot of learning on my own. So that's where it is.
So hence the business background. We might talk a little bit more about how you apply it now, Spriha, in your job as we go along. But Yasmeen, in the same vein, what brought you into what used to be called the rough old trade?
Well, it's a very good question. And quite like Spriha, I kind of stumbled into journalism as well. We have a pretty similar background in that way. Mine also started, my love of journalism, I should say, also started at university. I was at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. I was studying international relations, fresh on campus as a freshman. And I saw that the school newspaper was hiring for writers. I kind of just applied as a fluke. I knew that I enjoyed writing. I really enjoyed writing about international affairs. Not really the topic that you would expect a student newspaper to write about, but actually our op-ed section was quite good at tackling sort of, any news of the day. But yeah, I ended up, becoming a news writer, became a news editor by the next semester, went up to managing editor. Needless to say, I spent far more time in that newsroom than I probably spent in class, but it was probably the best informal journalism education I could have asked for. And I was very lucky because at the end of my time there, I applied for an editorial fellowship at The Atlantic, which is where I am now. And I started my career there in Washington, D.C. at their main kind of headquarters. And I joined The Atlantic in 2016, which, of course, was kind of a big banner year in terms of big shifts around the world. We had the election of Donald Trump. We, of course, had the Brexit referendum here in the UK, the election of Emmanuel Macron in France. And that was sort of how I got my inroads into covering Europe. I covered the French election and also the sort of Burkini saga, if anyone remembers that, from 2016, 2017. And that was kind of the beginning of what would be a really great adventure across the Atlantic. The London bureau just happened to open towards the end of my fellowship. So they sent me here and I've been here ever since.
Great. Well, slight generational shift in my case, because I actually, like Yasmeen, I was a student journalist. I was on Charwell, the Oxford University newspaper. I was editor of that. I have to say it was in the late 80s. That was not the 1880s. It can sometimes feel that way. And thereafter, I joined the Times as a trainee, London Times, and I ended up covering the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm a German specialist, the Balkan Wars, many other periphery wars, which are periphery wars as we called them then to Russia rather impolitely. But as we can see by the terrible events in Ukraine, they have a habit of recurring and growing. And that's exactly the 30-something year, the span, I suppose, that I'm looking at now as I look at Ukraine coverage. So I did all of that. And then I became an executive and a political columnist for 20 years, the Evening Standard in the UK. And then moved to The Economist a good decade ago, first to be policy editor, subsequently then to run our audio outfit, and then to do the job that I now do, which is a mix of audio, but also some strategy work. So it's quite interesting, I think, from all of us. Obviously, my guests will have they've got more headspace than I have, headroom, I should say, ahead of them in terms of their careers. But you can pivot quite quickly in journalism. And I think that brings us, if I can come back to you, Spriha, I think people get very interested and a bit confused as to how people who start out often writing, like you, they turn up at, in your case, at City University as super bright graduates. You all want to write. Many of you want to change the world or at least influence it through your writing. And then when we check in, you've become these grandly titled editors. What gives? What took you that way?
That's a really good question. And often that I'm asked, because yes, you're right. I still love writing. I still steal some time from the day to sit down and write, and just sort of, because that's what we all want to do. I think it's somewhere down the line, I really enjoyed assigning. I really also enjoyed sort of brainstorming story ideas. And I think like whenever there would be a big event, I would step up in the newsroom and I would sort of help the editor to say, we should look at a particular story from this point of view and that point of view. Can I help you with sources? Can I take a first look at your story? So I think I always enjoyed that. I never really thought I would be an editor. I thought it's part of being a journalist. And then a job opportunity came up at CNBC where my editor actually asked me to apply for that job. And he said, I think you'll be great at being the deputy editor. Why don't you apply for that job? And until then, I'd never thought that I could be an editor. I thought, I love being a reporter. And I went ahead and applied for that job and I got it. So I was the deputy bureau chief for CNBC, for the international division. And I really felt that this is what I want to do, because one, you get to learn so much by editing other people's pieces. I've primarily been a financial journalist, but when I would be editing sports stories, I don't know, I still don't understand football, and I'm being very honest about it. But when I started editing sports pieces and that's when I understood how things work, how football can actually, sort of impact economics as well among countries. How we talk about Stockonomics quite a lot. And then just sort of being able to help some junior reporters and coach and mentor. And that's something I've always enjoyed. And that's a big part of my current role as well. So I think it's probably just understanding what your strengths are. And in my case, I realized that my strengths are, sort of assigning and brainstorming and coaching and mentoring. And I just leaned into my strengths a bit more.
Okay, so that's fascinating. And absolutely, I think you know it yourself, don't you? Sometimes you have to be both in your career, but to sort of decide where your strength lies or where you feel more comfortable and perhaps is the best advice. I think some people almost resist it because they think, well, I came in to be a star columnist. It's, why do I want to be a deputy editor or assistant editor on the news desk? I would say to people, there are so many routes through journalism that take the one that's in front of you that you feel comfortable with. It's la vie s'arrange, as the French say. Life arranges itself. So don't get too stuck on one route. What do you think, Yasmeen? I mean, I'm interested. You have what looks on paper like a completely plum job. You sit in London, but you have the right to roam in Europe, which is always definitely something to aspire to, not least because it really annoys people in the other European bureaus. But you have that right. And you obviously, I'm joking, because you do sort out who's going to do what story. And you look particularly at shifts and disruptions in politics, which sometimes come in the bucket called populism and nationalism. How do you decide what you want to cover? What's the process that you would go through with your editors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really, part of the challenge, I think, of covering populism and nationalism, which I think, as you just mentioned, I wrote a piece a few years ago about how populism had kind of just become a catch-all phrase for things that we don't like. And so a big challenge of my beat was to really try to develop a proper kind of almost academic understanding of the term and the phenomenon and nationalism as well. I would probably, just to briefly summarize it, I think populism is best understood as sort of a style of politics, not so much an ideology, but rather a way of speaking, a way of framing things. And if, in populism's case, it's framing things as, the people, the quote unquote real people versus an elite of some kind. And, we've seen that dynamic on the left and on the right in countries around the world. So in terms of my job, I basically give myself the task of trying to identify when I see that trend or trends in countries around the world. In 2017, obviously, we saw a lot of it in Europe. However, we also see it in places like India, like Brazil, like Turkey. So the challenge there is that I kind of have to forge many beats, really try to develop as much of an understanding as I can of these different countries. As you mentioned, not always being in them, not always getting to visit them, but to try to develop relationships there, to speak with people who know these places a lot better than I do, and to try to draw upon the trends that I'm seeing around the world to help kind of explain what's happening, to point to the similarities. Someone in Britain may kind of understand the role that nationalism, or even sort of populist elements, like, the British people versus the bureaucrats in Brussels, that sort of dynamic there. Not all populisms are the same, I should mention, but, or nationalisms. But, to kind of help people in the States with Donald Trump, how can they see what's happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro? and kind of understand both the key differences, but also the similarities with what they're seeing in their country. So often, I'll just be keeping tabs on these countries that I'm interested in, where I've seen these trends, flag it with my editor. And like Spriha said, we have conversations. We talk about, what's most interesting. And what really drew me to The Atlantic when I applied as a senior in university was I loved that it answered the questions that I didn't know I had. And so a lot of times I try to trust my gut intuition that when I have a question that I think is interesting, that I hope that our readers perhaps share that curiosity and maybe I can answer that question for them. So that's usually what guides me. But also the news guides me. I mean, I've been, like many people, covering Ukraine, which obviously, there could be some elements of nationalism there, particularly with regard to Russia and even Ukrainian nationalism. But, that doesn't necessarily fall strictly within the beat. But, I go where the news goes. So.
That's interesting as you talk about judgment and that sense of kind of, using your own judgment, sometimes also your gut to decide which stories you should pursue, because obviously every story you pursue, you're probably not giving time to something else you could just as well be doing. And I wondered, particularly as we're talking here in the context in which the shift to digital journalism is obviously on everyone's minds. I've just returned from researching digital journalism in Germany, where the pivot from newsstand to digital is just quite a remarkable graph, and it is widening very fast, and replenishers that is coming to brands tend to be coming now more through the digital routes. So that changes journalism, and it certainly has changed journalism since I was first around in it, around 1989-90. I mean, the internet was sort of barely born. So how much do you think that we need to change what we do with that digital component in mind? And Srivastava, does it change the way that you make decisions? Because, of course, you can track the data so acutely now as to what is being read, listened to, consumed, what people make of it, or where they simply pass. And is that on your mind?
Yeah, it's always on our minds, and it's changed so much. Journalism has changed so much. I mean, I've been in the industry for a little over 15 years now, and it's really changed in the way we look at news, we approach news, we break down news. And as Yasmeen said, I mean, of course, news leads us. We follow the news. But how do we break down that news for our readers is something that where we use data quite a lot. So to give you an example, if you're writing about if the Fed decides to raise interest rates, we will of course write about the Fed raising interest rates. But what we are also interested in doing is breaking that concept down to how that impacts a common person, how that impacts the food that is being served on their table. So we are going to try and use the big economic concepts, but also sort of try and bridge that gap between that economic concept and our reader. And I think that is what has changed quite a lot. And why that has changed is because, like you mentioned, we use data to track now. So if we constantly engage with our readers. So if we see that our readers are engaging with us on content that are explainers, that are educating them about a particular topic, then we want to do more of that, because clearly there's an appetite for something like that. We still continue to follow the news flow. We will still put news flow at the top of everything else. But how we cover that news has changed a little bit over a period of time. And I think it's for the good. I think it's good that we are able to now engage with our audiences to know exactly what our audiences care about. And they're changing. The dynamics of audiences also changing. The demographics keep changing. So I think it's for the good.
Yasmeen, do you think about who your reader is? And you see, the slight challenge I would have to what Spriha has laid out, and I'm also the beneficiary of having a lot of information. Certainly, we take our feedback from readers very seriously, and we track who's reading what. But we will always have at The Economist a commitment to global coverage, and that's not going to change. But there is, I think, something that does creep on, which is an awareness if you've got certain areas that are not getting that traffic, as we now call it in digital, that maybe you have to push that bit harder to get that piece through. And to what extent do you think, well, this is going to land well with my audience, and this maybe is going to be a heavier lift?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, in terms of thinking about who my audience is, I know that The Atlantic is read around the world. I know that the large proportion of that readership comes from North America, obviously the United States and Canada. But our third largest readership is actually here in the UK, hence our pivot to this side of the Atlantic. But I think generally speaking, when I'm writing, I try to make the story as accessible as possible to anyone, anywhere around the world. And that means knowing that, obviously we're an American magazine. I'm not going to be using British spelling or anything like that. Britishisms typically get pulled out of my copy. I've lived here too long because, suddenly I'm trying to think of examples, but they're not coming through. Calling football and soccer and switching those two has actually surprisingly been more of a challenge than I anticipated it to be. But, generally speaking, I think for me, I try to, when I write my stories, especially when they come to like complicated topics such as global affairs and sort of what's happening, to understand that our readers aren't necessarily going to be ensconced in those particular countries and places, and that the story needs to feel accessible to anyone, but also not so basic so that someone who's, a keen follower of French politics, say, would feel like that piece isn't for them. There's that concept in journalism called the explanatory comma, which of course I'm sure everyone here in this Zoom chat is familiar with, where you try to basically, a quick aside to sort of explain a concept that may not be totally understood to the average reader. But you want to do it in a way, right, where someone reads this and they feel like it's still for them. Say you're an expert on this, you may come to a piece and you're like, gosh, this is really like bare bones. This isn't for me. I never want readers to feel that way. So that's kind of, with my readership, I do try to kind of be broad-minded, I guess, in that way. I mean, it helps, of course, that I hear from readers a lot of the time, mostly, sometimes via Twitter, and that's not always the most constructive place, but often via email. The readers, I should say, who are kind enough to write in. They're not always kind in their emails, but they do tend to be quite constructive, and I do try to respond to them all. But like a lot of journalists, I also keep track on how my stories perform, and I kind of try to look and see what stories perform better than others. For example, I find that trend pieces, particularly as it related to the pandemic, comparing and contrasting how different countries attempted to do different things, those tend to actually get a lot of interest. And while I do keep that in mind, it informs sort of how I identify stories, to the point that you made, Anne, about, the stories that perhaps aren't as covered or don't get as much interest. The one thing that I've really appreciated about my time in the Atlantic is that, we don't, obviously every journalism outlet wants high readership, but I've never felt the need to chase clicks. If we think a story is important on merit, we're going to do it. And that I think is kind of really gratifying. I mean, obviously, the thing that I do find a little frustrating in my job is sometimes I will work on a piece for days, if not weeks, loads of reporting. It's a labor of love. I put it out there and it just doesn't get that much. I mean, there's a decent readership, but not much. Compare it to the quick hit I do one day covering a topic I just kind of know off the back of my hand. I don't really need to talk to many people. Boom. It feels like it's read by everyone and my mother. And that's like, it really depends. But, I try not to, then only do those pieces and not do the ones that you kind of pour your soul into, because I think those pieces are really important. And frankly, I think they're why a lot of journalists get into journalism.
I think they're all excellent points that you're both making. And I would say it's always really hard is when people talk about quality media to say that, it seems to have the implication somebody else isn't quality media. I've worked in the middle market. I've been deputy editor at the London Evening Standard, which is a very broad reach. The Economist is obviously is a sort of different proposition, but both, I think, rightly would call themselves quality. And I think the difference is exactly, I think, Yasmeen, you gave us a great example there, which is, will you still cover something because your editors believe in it and your writers believe in it and you've taken an editorial decision? Otherwise, you're in a different world, which will be a business model, but it can be simply a click-chasing model, or it can possibly be looking at other metrics for success. And to me, what you get if you are advertising with a quality media product or reading it, or if you're grazing it, you may not like it, you might want to go to another one, but you are getting an edited experience. I mean, that's sort of, rightly or wrongly, I think that's what you're paying for, because that is the difference, that there have been conversations about what you're covering. You didn't just sort of have a look at the chart or the algorithm that morning and go, Do you know what? Today I'm thinking Yasmeen's piece. So let's talk a bit about formats, because they are changing. And certainly in my lifetime as a writer, first writer, then writer, broadcaster, now podcast host, I do a lot of other broadcast in the UK. But at the same time, I consider myself at heart a print journalist. And if you give me long form, I'm very, very happy. Most of us like a lot of words. So I'm interested to hear from both of you, Ms. Spriha, both as an editor, but also your personal pleasures. What are the formats that you like most? And I think, you can also say if there are any you don't really like or you find is not for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm thinking about it now. I mean, I think my comfort area is a long form, and I absolutely love writing long forms. But I also work in a very fast-paced newsroom. I've always worked in a very fast-paced newsroom, which where spot news is sort of the way of the day, as they say, and it's about getting news as quickly out as possible. So at CNBC as well, for instance, we were trying to produce as much news as possible in a day. At Insider as well, there are 2 desks that I oversee that are very strong, fast-paced news desks. But having said that, the stories that sit behind the paywall at Insider, the stories that are we call the prime content, they're all sort of a lot more research, a lot more deep dives, and a lot more sort of investigation, scoops, and so on and so forth. And like features as well, which automatically falls into sometimes the long form side of things that I am talking about. And I think personally, as a journalist, I've always found a lot more sort of happiness to be able to write and research along form, the sort of the talking to sources, the taking your time, the sort of being able to think about a story, like really take a step back and think about a story and, take some time to write that. But I don't see a lot of that in the newsrooms these days. I do think that there is a lot of scope for it, but the packaging of news has changed a lot, and there is a lot more focus on getting news out as quickly as possible, packaging news into smaller, there's a number of reasons for it. One, of course, is the user experience as well. Like if you look at readers and how they're engaging, again, where do people's interests start to drop? I think a lot of readers prefer smaller news pieces. And that's why, so we have a rule as well about not going above a certain word count if it's a spot news story. If it's anything more than that, then of course, you have to come and speak to your editor and brainstorm that story idea, and then eventually that gets published. But for any spot news, we don't go above 500 words, so to speak. So I think I feel like that's changed quite a lot as well in terms of how readers are consuming news. The pattern is very different on the weekend, though. I think weekend people like that escapism. They like to take a step back. They like to read longer pieces. There is a lot more appetite for long form. So we keep a lot of our long form pieces for weekends as well. But through the weekday, I feel people are like very busy. They don't have the time. So they just want you to package the news for them very quickly and be able to present it to them. But personally, I think I'm a big fan of the long form.
Yasmeen, what about you? I mean, the Atlantic is one of the big long form, also kind of enhanced long form. It sort of looked a lot more at its formats, I think, in recent years, and linked them up also to podcasting. What do you like doing best?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm a huge lover of writing and also reading long form. I often have to remind myself that, I think one of the challenges of working at a place like the Atlantic, I obviously read a lot of news from many, many outlets, but I have to remind myself that I was not hired to read the Atlantic, because sometimes there'll be certain days where I look at the homepage and all I want to do is just read what my colleagues have written. But yeah, I mean, the Atlantic has always traditionally been a place for analysis, for long form. I mean, kind of to Spriha's point, some publications, they're quick with the news. They're telling their readers what's happened when it's happened. I think the Atlantic knows that it isn't necessarily the place that people will go to for that first news hit, but it is where they will go to for that sort of second day or even the first day. We try to be quick with our with our stories, but that sort of analysis, started trying to okay, we already know what's happened. Now we want to understand why. So I've always really fancied that kind of more analytical, but still accessible type of journalism. And, not every piece needs to be a 10,000 word essay. That you can find those at The Atlantic, especially in our magazine issues, which are always available online as well. But for me, typically, I think a piece tends to be at around like 1,200 words. So, I tend to go for sort of that middle range is kind of the usual sort of story, not too short, but also not too long. It's kind of, I think a pretty easy amount for a reader to kind of bite off and chew on for 5-6 minutes before they move on to the next thing. That said, I mean, I've done a few podcasts for The Atlantic, and I do some outside of The Atlantic. I'm a regular on the Bunker podcast, which is sort of an independent British podcast, typically talking about kind of the news of the day. I do love podcasts, and I do, especially as a news consumer, I love listening to podcasts. I love the New York Times. I mean, obviously they have their daily, I feel like this is almost wrong. I was like, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to talk about other outlets beyond, but anyway, I love the New York Times. I listen to a lot of podcasts and regularly, and that was sort of what I did on my commute. But even, the New York Times is coming up as an example here, but, I know increasingly a lot of publications do this. Well, they'll have their long reads be read sort of in the form of a podcast. So say you want to have your weekend long read, but you want to do it while you're on a walk, then you can sort of just listen to that. And I always really enjoyed that. The Atlantic has a couple of great podcasts, The Experiment being one of them, where that's just kind of the perfect way to tell a story, which you could do in the form of print or digital. But it's just such an enjoyable experience for the reader, or for the listener, I should say, to be able to hear the different voices, to kind of hear the process that the journalists went through covering that story, how their thinking changed along the way. I just find it to be a completely immersive and enjoyable experience.
I think that's, as I say, having led audio here for a lot of years, what we've tried to do is add value there. I have to say, when it comes to reading out stories, most of your reader feedback is going to be, do they like the voice of the person reading you the story? And I would arrive sometimes to find someone saying, I really can't understand this voice because it's got a Scottish accent. And then the next one would say, you need more diversity of accents in your reading. And then someone else would say, yes, but are there enough American voices? And then the fourth email would say, too many American voices, and nice to say. Thank you so much for all of your feedback, and then desperately try to make a team put together. But that brings us to diversity, and diversity in the media. Spriha, tell me a bit about that. The media, rightly, along with all other big institutions in society, perhaps a bit more in the spotlight on this issue than previously. Who is getting into it, who is getting on well within it, different forms of diversity, and the potential there for how do you satisfy so many people who have different views on what diversity is. What's your own experience been on this?
Yeah, I think I came to this country 15 years ago, and like I said, I was raised in India. I was raised in a very in a place where media was very sort of viewed very differently. In India, when I came here to study journalism and I started working, or actually started finding work to start with, it wasn't easy because I felt like I did not fit in, and I wasn't able to understand sort of the Fleet Street networking drinks, as they say. Like I would go in and not really know who to talk to. It also felt, for like, I'm a person of color, so being a person of color, it also felt slightly unfriendly in many instances, a bit hostile. But eventually, I got around to it. I started making friends. I thankfully had a mentor who was really, really helpful, being able to sort of explain to me how to go about finding jobs, how to go about finding internships, who to speak with. But otherwise, it's a bit daunting initially. It's a bit daunting to be able to take your first step in the world of journalism in a place that's absolutely new to you, where you have no friends, you've got no idea how things work. And also, English is not my first language. And that is something that was reminded to me a number of times while I was applying for jobs, which initially at that point of time, I thought, yeah, actually, they're right. English is not my first language. But later on, it dawned upon me that even if English is not my first language, I am a journalist. I do write English stories. I have being taught in English as medium of instruction. So it is I'm being discriminated just because English is not my first language. So I think having that self-awareness over a period of time really helped. And I think something that I do quite a lot is in my role is mentor a number of journalists, mentor a number of young journalists. We at Insider also have a very strong focus on diversity and inclusion. So when we are hiring as well, we go out and about as wide as the talent pool could be. We don't rush to make those decisions. Personally, I speak at a number of events where I can talk about diversity in journalism, and hopefully I can help and inspire more and more young men and women of color who can join journalism and not feel daunted at the initial challenge that is, sort of thrown upon them. And I'm so glad that I was able to navigate through those challenges, because at one point I actually thought, should I just go back to India and maybe work there if I'm not really getting a chance to work here? But then I thought, no, hang on, let me try and figure out a way to do this. I'm sure that there are lots of other, and I did see there were lots of other journalists of color who are so successful in this country. So I said, they must have done something right. So I need to figure out what they did. And, thankfully they inspired me. So in short, I think I'm hoping that, I'm able to inspire more people, and I try and do as much as I can from my part, but my company is also like really helping in doing that. So together we are able to sort of really be out there, and, everything that we do, whether it's reporting or writing or hiring, recruitment, training, everything through the lens of DEI, which is a big win, for me.
Yasmeen, what's your experience been? And a bit like, just an interesting question, isn't it? How much we are driven by what we see around us and how much we decide. Spriha says she thought of going back to India, and she thought, no, I can sort of crack this here if I want to. And I think it is a mixture. You will find role models, but you also have to find some strength in yourself to say, this is what I'm going to do. And if someone is really excluding me, I will find a way to break through that. And I will challenge that, and I'll get support to challenge it, which I think now in most institutions is probably a bit, I don't want to say it's easier, but I think it's more accessible than it was. And I don't know if Sri has that feeling as well. I think looking back, there was a sense of, that would be being a bit awkward squad to raise something and say, I feel I might have been discriminated against, would have been, it's just not worth the hassle. I hope that we now consider it worth the effort, worth the hassle. But what's your own experience been?
Yeah, like Spriha, I was very lucky to have amazing mentorship early on. I think this industry can be quite daunting in a lot of ways, both in terms of just getting your foot in the door, but also, this is, I think we've seen, especially over the last few years, that, sometimes that this industry doesn't always feel the most secure. And I think it's something that journalists talk about a lot. I think a lot of publications, including The Atlantic, thankfully, diversity inclusion is something that we talk about a lot. I think newsrooms are really waking up to the fact that actually having that diversity in all of its forms is a huge asset to a newsroom. It means that you're seeing and understanding stories in a different way, and you're able to deliver that nuance and those different views to your reader. For example, it's Ramadan currently. I was raised in a Palestinian Muslim family. I'm not the only person who can write about Ramadan, of course, and I don't necessarily write about it every year. But a couple of years ago, I did write a piece about, what it's like to experience Ramadan in a pandemic and how it sort of changed the way we engage with this really important month. And I was able to kind of insert a bit of myself in that way, not in a way that was, made the story about me or anything like that. I really don't like doing that, but I think it does provide the reader with something I think that's very valuable, and I think that newsrooms prioritizing that, I think, is incredibly important. But beyond just the kind of traditional forms of diversity we think of in terms of kind of sex and gender, your ethnic background, et cetera. I think socioeconomic diversity is also something that's incredibly important, and I know particularly for kind of those new those schemes for early career journalists, whether it's internships or fellowships, those are incredible opportunities. It's how I got my job, but they're not always the most accessible, especially to people who are coming from lower income backgrounds. And, I know that this is something that thankfully, I know The Atlantic really took on board when it kind of was considering how much it was paying its fellows, but I have friends who started in journalism too. And we were all kind of talking about, okay, we want to do these amazing jobs, but we also want to afford to live in cities like New York and New York City and Washington, DC and London. How do you do that? So I think, newsrooms kind of prioritizing making sure that even their young journalists who are just starting are making a living wage where, you don't have to choose between following your passion, but also being able to afford it. Because, what happens if these, with free internships or unpaid fellowships or things like that is that, people might love the opportunity. It might be amazing. They might get it, but they don't necessarily have the ability to rely on their family for that extra support and things like that. So I think that's really important. It's refreshing to see that newsrooms are taking that into consideration. I think obviously we can see more of it, but yeah.
I think we're getting towards the end of our time, and I can't resist because I think one should always treat an outing with other journalists as if we were in a bar. And I'm wondering whose expenses tab this one's going to go on. So what we might find ourselves talking about, if we just got to know each other over a glass of something nice, would be, what's the best story we've ever worked on? And it doesn't have to be the most significant for geopolitics or for your publication, but the one where you really thought, this career takes me to a place or to a story, to an experience I otherwise wouldn't have been able to have, and I'm going to tell my grandchildren about it until they say, "Oh, stop it, Grandma." Yeah, let's go the other way. Spriha.
Okay, so a number of stories, but one that comes to mind, and I won't really name the company here, but because the story never got published, unfortunately. But I got very close to a massive scoop, and I had to spike it for some other reasons. But I got to know from some sources about some wrongdoing at a bank, and I just kept chasing the lead and just kept chasing for a really long time. And then one thing led to the other, and then one thing led to the other. I found myself in like this web of a lot of sort of information that was being thrown at me. And this was just myself. And I kept telling my editor about this. And I said, this is going to be a really big story. And the only reason we couldn't publish it is because all of the, so we had all of the sources anonymous. Nobody wanted to go on the record. And there was a lot of legal element that was getting into the story. It was contradicting every now and then. But so we decided to sort of leave the story. And then the Financial Times went ahead and published it 2 days later, pretty much the same story. And I remember sitting there with the newspaper being very upset about this particular story because I thought this was my story. We didn't publish it. I still have it written in draft somewhere. But I think this is something that I'm going to tell my grandchildren about, that if you have an instinct, if there's a hunch and you know that you can do it, and just trust yourself and go ahead and do it. Don't worry about the consequences. But still go ahead and chase it, because I would not have felt so bad that day looking at that story being published by another media outlet. So that's my lesson there, actually.
It's a very good lesson. Yes, push ahead with your instinct and your great research. Please consult your lawyers before you do that. Or make sure that your editors have consulted your lawyers, because mistakes can be expensive. Yes, Yasmeen, what have you? You've had a wonderful ticket to ride, haven't you, around Europe, transatlantic. What's the story that you go back to in your head? That's been my story I'm really proud to have been able to take part in.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's kind of like choosing your favorite child. To be honest, one of the pieces I'm probably looking back and most proud of was actually a piece I reported on mostly during the lockdown, which was kind of somewhat limiting. I think the lockdown had kind of almost just opened. You could kind of do a few things. And this was sort of a long read on the Uyghurs, who are what it means to protect your culture from destruction and from afar. So for this piece, I spoke to Uyghurs living here in the UK. I visited my first Uyghur restaurant, and I think one of the reasons the story popped into my head was remembering the delicious noodles that I got to eat over the course of this reporting, purely for research, of course. But then also spoke to Uyghurs as far afield as Turkey, France, the United States. So it was a piece that both allowed me to do some on-the-ground reporting here in the UK, but it also enabled me to, there were just so many different layers in terms of, also understanding even Sephardic Jewry and keeping the Ladino language alive, like that came into the piece. So there were a lot of different elements. It was just, I got to speak to so many people, and it was just, Yeah, it just felt like an important story. It was one of those pieces where it did perform very well, but I didn't actually care if that many people, I mean, I obviously want people to read the pieces, but even if it didn't perform that well in terms of metrics, I think I would have been very proud that the story was done because I felt like it told a really important story. And if I get to enjoy a wonderful culture while doing it, so be it.
Yes, a bit of wonderful culture while doing it, and preferably a story where the cuisine is good is also a help. That said, I spent lots of years in war zones where that wasn't really the priority. I think probably mine would have to be. I think if you've covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, you do think, well, I've had my seat at the ring side of history, so I would go with that. I found war reporting difficult. You get better at it. You get technically better at it, and it's important. So I enjoyed that. And I thought, just to end on a light note, I was sitting in the office one day, I think it was deputy editor at Independent on Sunday at the time. And someone said, there's a guy in New York, this is now a few years ago, so inflation, consider this, he's a British guy and he cuts hair in New York and he's $1,000 haircut man. Do you want to go? Well, I mean, has anyone ever said, hell yes, faster? I thought this is the reward for having all that time with no access to hairdressers, face down in a ditch, was that I got to have the $1,000 haircut. And what can I tell you, ladies and gentlemen? It was a good haircut. And on that note of stories that we've done that changed the world, I will pass you back to Belinda for some final thoughts.
Thank you so much. I am in awe of all three of you. I've been very lucky to work on the commercial side of this industry over a number of years, but I've always just wished that I could be one of you, and sitting listening to it was just fascinating. So I'd like to thank all three of you for sharing some insights into what it is to be the creators of some of the world's most engaging media, because those media just simply wouldn't exist without you. So thank you so much, all three. I hope you'll join us next time for our next podcast. We're going to be joined by colleagues from the Washington Post and Politico, and we're going to be talking about influencing the influencers. If you haven't already subscribed to our podcast, please do so. And also worth going to have a look on our website, because we do all sorts of other briefing events and activities, news. So that's www.worldmediagroup.com. And with that, ladies, again, thank you very much and hope to see you again soon. Thank you. The World Media Group is an alliance of the world's leading international media organizations that connects brands with highly engaged, influential audiences in the context of trusted and renowned journalism. For further information, please go to our website, world-media-group.com.